The Reconquista of Spain lasted 781 years. On the morning of January 2nd, 1492, the last Sultan of Granada rode out through the gates of the most beautiful palace in Europe and handed its keys to a queen he had never met. Behind him, 8 centuries of Islamic civilization, libraries, courts, medicine, architecture, the most sophisticated world the medieval West had ever produced. Before the year was out, that same queen had expelled every Jewish person from Spain and funded a sailor's voyage west into an ocean no European had ever crossed. 3 decisions, 1 year, 1 woman, and none of it was coincidence. The fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, the opening of the Americas. These were not separate events that happened to share a calendar. They were the same decision, made by the same logic, driven by the same force that had been building for nearly 8 centuries. Most accounts treat 1492 as an ending. It was not an ending. To understand what it actually was, you have to go back to where it began. In the spring of 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed a narrow strip of water between North Africa and the southern tip of Europe with an army of roughly 7,000 men. The stretch of water was barely 14 kilometers wide. The limestone rock they landed beneath would later carry his name, Jabal al-Tariq. The world would come to call it Gibraltar. The kingdom waiting on the other side was called Hispania, and it was in trouble long before Tariq arrived. The Visigoths had ruled it for roughly 3 centuries, but by 711, their kingdom was fracturing from within. A disputed succession had split the nobility into rival factions, and King Roderick, who had seized the throne only a year earlier, was fighting a civil war on his own territory when the crossing came. Tariq did not come uninvited. One account holds that Julian, the Visigothic lord of Ceuta, invited the Muslim south to settle his own grievance against Roderick. Whatever the true reason, the invitation met a force that was ready to move. The Umayyad Caliphate, based in Damascus, had been pushing the boundaries of its empire westward for decades. The Iberian Peninsula was the next frontier. The decisive moment came in July of 711 at a place called Guadalete in the south of what is now Spain. Roderick marched his army to meet Tariq and was defeated. The last Visigoth king of Spain fell in battle, and with him fell whatever remained of the kingdom's cohesion. Within 3 years, Tariq and his reinforced army had swept through most of the peninsula. A kingdom 3 centuries old had collapsed in a single campaigning season. The speed of the conquest is still striking. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, fell without a prolonged resistance. City after city surrendered or negotiated terms. Part of the reason was military. The Umayyad forces were disciplined and battle-hardened, but part of it was political. Many Hispano-Roman populations had no deep loyalty to their Visigothic overlords, and the Jewish communities who had faced persecution under the Visigoths in several cases opened their gates willingly. What the conquerors built on the ruins of the Visigothic kingdom was not an occupation. It was a civilization. They called it Al-Andalus, a name whose origins are still debated but whose meaning would become unambiguous over the following 2 centuries. It would become the most intellectually sophisticated, the most urbanized, and by several measures the most prosperous society in the Western world. To understand what Al-Andalus became, you have to understand what Europe looked like at the same time. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the kingdoms of northern Europe were largely agricultural, largely illiterate beyond the clergy, and largely cut off from the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. Libraries in Christian Europe typically held dozens of manuscripts. The roads left by Rome were crumbling. The cities were shrinking. This was the world Al-Andalus was born into, and the contrast was not subtle. Cordoba was the capital, and by the 10th century it was something without parallel in the Western world. Its population has been estimated at over 100,000 people, at a time when London held perhaps 15,000 and Paris not many more. Its streets were paved. After dark, they were lit. A traveler arriving from the Christian north would have found it not merely impressive but almost incomprehensible, a city operating at a scale and sophistication that had no equivalent north of the Pyrenees. The Caliph al-Hakam II, who ruled from 961 to 976, was a man whose obsession with books bordered on the consuming. He sent agents across the Islamic world, to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Damascus, with instructions to acquire manuscripts by any means available. The royal library he assembled in Cordoba is believed to have held over 400,000 volumes. The catalogue alone ran to 44 volumes. The largest library in Christian Europe at the same moment held perhaps 400 manuscripts. Beyond the royal library, Cordoba had 70 public libraries open to anyone who wished to use them. There were libraries in the Great Mosque, in universities, in private homes. The city was described by a Christian nun from Lower Saxony, a woman named Hrowitha who had no reason to flatter it, as the ornament of the world. A place where one could walk for 10 miles through continuous buildings, along streets lit through the night. The knowledge held in those libraries was not merely preserved, it was active. Al-Andalus was the western terminus of a vast intellectual network that had been absorbing and transforming the learning of the ancient world for generations. Greek science, Persian mathematics, Indian astronomy, all of it had flowed into Arabic, been refined by Islamic scholars, and was now being studied, debated, and extended in the libraries and courts of Cordoba. Europe had lost most of this inheritance after the fall of Rome. Al-Andalus was keeping it alive. The practical consequences of this knowledge were visible everywhere. Andalusian agriculture was transformed by techniques and crops that the Visigoths had never known: rice, hard wheat, sugarcane, cotton, oranges, watermelons, bananas, all introduced or expanded under Moorish cultivation. Irrigation systems, using water wheels and underground channels, turned arid southern land into productive farmland. Fields that had been left fallow every other year under Roman and Visigothic practice were now producing year-round. The population ate better, lived longer, and grew. In medicine, Andalusian physicians were working from a body of knowledge that Christian Europe would not access for another 2 centuries. The works of Galen and Hippocrates had been translated, annotated, and extended by Islamic scholars. Surgeons in Cordoba were performing procedures, cataract operations, surgical instruments designed for specific tasks that belonged to a medical tradition simply unavailable anywhere else in Europe. When the kings of Leon or Navarre needed a physician, they applied to Cordoba. In 822, a musician arrived in Cordoba from Baghdad who would change the way Europe ate, dressed, and listened to music. His name was Ali ibn Nafi, but everyone called him Ziryab, the blackbird, for his voice and his dark complexion. He had been trained at the most refined court in the Islamic world and carried with him a cultural fluency that Cordoba had never encountered. Within years of his arrival, he had founded what may have been Europe's first formal music conservatory, introduced seasonal fashion to the Andalusian court, and restructured the way meals were served, separating courses, introducing tablecloths, replacing communal platters with individual dishes. His students spread his innovations across Europe and North Africa. Much of what medieval Europe would consider refinement passed through him. This was the civilization Hrowitha called the ornament of the world. But what made Al-Andalus genuinely unusual, what distinguished it from every other great medieval civilization, was not its libraries or its agriculture or its music. It was the arrangement of the people living inside it. Muslims, Christians, and Jews shared Cordoba not merely as residents of the same city, but as participants in the same intellectual and political life. Christians served in the Umayyad court. Jews held positions of significant administrative authority. The great Jewish philosopher and physician Maimonides was a product of Andalusian intellectual culture. The translation projects that would eventually carry ancient knowledge into European universities were carried out by teams of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars working from the same texts. This coexistence had a name. Later historians would call it the convivencia, the living together. The word was coined retrospectively, and scholars have argued ever since about how accurately it captures the reality. It was not equality. It was not without discrimination or periods of violence. Non-Muslims paid a tax that Muslims did not. Social hierarchies were real and enforced. But the convivencia was not a myth either. The documented record of shared scholarship, shared courts, shared cities, and shared intellectual projects is too extensive and too specific to be dismissed. Something genuinely unusual was happening in Al-Andalus, something that had no real parallel elsewhere in the medieval world. The translation movement that grew out of this arrangement was among the most consequential intellectual projects in human history. When Toledo fell to Christian forces in 1085, the scholars who gathered there to translate the Arabic manuscripts they found did not find backward or primitive texts. They found Aristotle, they found Ptolemy, they found Euclid, Galen, and Al-Khwarizmi, whose name would give the world the word algorithm and whose work would give it algebra. They found centuries of Arabic commentary, extension, and original scholarship built on top of the ancient foundations. When the first European universities were established in the 13th century, the textbooks they used were translations produced from Arabic manuscripts found in the libraries of Al-Andalus. Thomas Aquinas read Aristotle because Andalusian scholars had kept him. None of this happened in isolation from conflict. Al-Andalus was not a peaceful paradise. The small Christian kingdoms that survived in the mountains of the north, Asturias, Leon, Navarre, the embryonic territories that would eventually become Castile and Aragon, had been pushing back against Moorish rule from the very beginning. There were raids, counter-raids, shifting borders, and periods of serious warfare. The idea that the Reconquista had not yet begun would have seemed strange to the fighters on either side. But the fighting that characterized the 8th and 9th centuries was not a holy war. It was territorial. And the civilization being contested was, by any measurable standard, the most impressive on the continent. By the middle of the 10th century, under the Caliph Abd al-Rahman III and his son al-Hakam II, Al-Andalus had reached the apex of what it would become. The Caliphate of Cordoba was recognized across the Islamic world as a center of power and culture. Ambassadors arrived from the Byzantine Emperor, from the Holy Roman Emperor, from the kings of Leon and Navarre. The city they entered was not merely larger and wealthier than anything in Christian Europe. It was operating according to a different idea of what a city could be. This is the world that existed before the Reconquista took the shape history has given it. Not a dark age waiting to be liberated, not a foreign occupation waiting to be expelled, a civilization, messy, contradictory, shot through with politics and violence like all civilizations, but one that was producing things the rest of the world could not yet produce, asking questions the rest of the world had not yet thought to ask, and keeping alive a body of knowledge that would, in time, make the European Renaissance possible. To understand what the Reconquista cost, you first have to understand what was there before it ended. Somewhere in the mountains of northern Spain, in the year 722, a Visigothic nobleman named Pelayo led a small band of fighters against a Moorish force sent to suppress a rebellion in the region of Asturias. The Moors were repelled. The engagement was small, a skirmish by the standards of the wars that surrounded it. But the kingdom that grew out of that moment would spend the next 7 centuries insisting it was the beginning of something. That insistence was not wrong. It was, however, a story told in retrospect, shaped to serve purposes that did not yet exist when the fighting happened. The word Reconquista, reconquest, was not used by the people who were supposedly conducting it. It entered the historical record much later, applied backwards across centuries of conflict that, while real and often brutal, had no unified name, no unified purpose, and no unified command. The fighters at Covadonga were not thinking about Spain. Spain did not exist. They were thinking about survival, about territory, about the particular grievances of a particular mountain kingdom against a particular occupying force. The Holy War framing came later. What actually existed in the 8th and 9th centuries was a patchwork. In the north, small Christian kingdoms clung to the mountains. Asturias, which would eventually become Leon and the embryonic territories that would grow into Navarre, Aragon, and Castile. In the south and center, Al-Andalus ruled most of the peninsula. Between them was a contested frontier zone that shifted constantly, raided, settled, abandoned, reclaimed, and that neither side could permanently hold. This was not a front line. It was a borderland in the fullest sense, where the rules of each world softened and blurred. The Christian kingdoms of the north spent nearly as much time fighting each other as they did fighting Muslim rulers. Castile fought Leon, Navarre fought Aragon. Alliances were made and broken with a frequency that made any fixed notion of Christian unity against a common enemy almost laughable. When Sancho the Great of Navarre died in 1035, he divided his kingdom among his sons, as was the custom. And within a generation, those sons were at war with one another, allying with whoever was useful, including the Muslim rulers to their south. The Muslim world of Al-Andalus was no more unified. The great caliphate of Cordoba had fractured in 1031 into a mosaic of small independent principalities called Taifa kingdoms: Zaragoza, Toledo, Seville, Granada, Valencia, and dozens more, each ruled by its own dynasty and each pursuing its own interest with little regard for the others. The Taifa kings fought each other constantly. They competed for territory, for trade routes, for prestige, and when they needed military leverage against a rival, they did not hesitate to hire it from the Christian north. The practical result was a political landscape that bore almost no resemblance to the religious war that later accounts would describe. Muslim Taifa kings paid tribute, called pariyas, to Christian kings in exchange for protection or neutrality. Christian knights served in Muslim armies. Muslim soldiers rode under Christian banners. The borders of the conflict ran not between faiths but between interests, and those interests shifted with the season, the harvest, and the ambitions of whoever was currently on the throne. Into this world, in around 1043, a boy was born in a village called Vivar, a few miles north of Burgos in the Kingdom of Castile. His name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. He would become the most celebrated military hero in Spanish history. He would be remembered as El Cid, a name derived from the Arabic word Sayyid, meaning Lord, and he would be enshrined as the embodiment of Christian knightly virtue, the champion of the Reconquista. The historical record of his life tells a considerably more interesting story. El Cid earned his reputation as a fighter in the service of the Castilian court, distinguishing himself in the wars of King Sancho II. When Sancho was killed and his brother Alfonso VI took the throne, Rodrigo's position became complicated. Alfonso did not fully trust him, and in 1081 he was exiled from Castile. With no Christian king willing to employ him on acceptable terms, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar took his skills to the market, and the market in 11th century Iberia did not sort itself by religion. He entered the service of the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza, Al-Muqtadir, and spent nearly a decade fighting for Muslim lords against both Muslim and Christian enemies. His first recorded battle experience had, in fact, come years earlier in 1063, when he and a contingent of Castilians fought on the side of the same Al-Muqtadir of Zaragoza against the Christian forces of Ramiro I of Aragon. The greatest hero of the Christian Reconquista began his military career fighting Christians on behalf of a Muslim employer. This was not considered scandalous at the time. It was considered professional. El Cid was not unusual in this. He was exemplary, which is to say, his career made visible what was normal across the whole peninsula. The military orders, the knight commanders, the mercenary companies that crisscrossed Iberia in the 10th and 11th centuries operated in a world where competence and payment mattered more than the faith of the man who was paying. The ideological framework of crusading holy war, which would eventually harden into the dominant narrative of the Reconquista, was simply not the operating reality on the ground for most of this period. The Taifa kings who watched their territories shrink under pressure from the north did not experience their situation primarily as a religious crisis. They experienced it as a political one. When they needed military help, they looked first to their neighbors, Muslim or Christian. It did not particularly matter. And when their neighbors could not help them, they looked further. In 1086, several Taifa kings facing pressure from Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon made a fateful decision. They sent a request across the Strait of Gibraltar to a dynasty that had recently consolidated power in North Africa. Their name was the Almoravids. The Almoravids were Berber warriors from the Western Sahara, rigidly orthodox in their faith and formidably disciplined in their fighting. They crossed into Iberia and met Alfonso's army at a place called Sagrajas in 1086, and they broke it. Alfonso escaped the field, but the military equation of the peninsula had shifted in a single afternoon. The Taifa kings who had invited them in had expected help and then departure. They got something else entirely. The Almoravids, having seen the weakness of the Taifa kingdoms for themselves, began to absorb them, replacing the sophisticated, cosmopolitan, philosophically tolerant courts of the Taifas with a stricter, less accommodating political culture that had little patience for the convivencia. El Cid's response to the Almoravid arrival was not to rally to the Christian cause, it was to pursue his own. Released from exile by Alfonso after the disaster at Sagrajas, he operated increasingly as an independent force, commanding an army of both Christian and Muslim soldiers, fighting against the Almoravids when it suited him, and against Christian forces when they threatened his position. In 1094 he took Valencia, ruling it as his own principality until his death in 1099. His court in Valencia included Muslim administrators. His army included Muslim soldiers. He received delegations from both Christian kings and Muslim emirs. The hero of the Reconquista died ruling a mixed city that he had taken not for Christendom but for himself. This was the world the Reconquista was actually fought in for most of its duration. Not a clean contest of faiths, but a dense, pragmatic, constantly renegotiated competition for territory and power in which the participants used whatever tools and alliances were available. The religious dimension was real. It would be wrong to dismiss it entirely. The Christian kingdoms did understand themselves as defending a Christian heritage. The Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus did understand themselves as part of an Islamic world. But the day-to-day reality of how wars were actually fought, how territory actually changed hands, and how people actually lived beside each other bore little resemblance to the binary the later myth required. The convivencia, that documented pattern of coexistence that had characterized Al-Andalus at its height, did not simply vanish as the Reconquista advanced, it mutated. When Toledo fell to Alfonso VI in 1085, the Muslim and Jewish populations of the city were not expelled, they remained. Alfonso himself styled his rule in terms that acknowledged his multi-faith subjects, calling himself in some documents emperor of the two religions. The Toledo that became a Christian city still contained functioning mosques, a large Jewish community, and the Arabic-speaking scholars whose translation work would eventually channel ancient knowledge into European universities. The conquest did not end the coexistence. It changed who was in charge of it. The 12th century brought a shift in tone. The Crusades, which had begun in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem, introduced a language and a logic into Christian Europe that gradually bled into the Iberian conflict. Crusade theology, the idea that fighting for territory against non-Christians was a spiritually meritorious act, that dying in such a fight earned divine reward, gave the Iberian campaigns a new ideological coding. The papacy began to take an active interest in framing the Reconquista as a crusade, which meant defining it as a holy war rather than a territorial one. For the Christian kings of the north, this framing was useful. It attracted foreign fighters, justified taxation for military purposes, and provided a vocabulary that made complex political ambitions sound like simple divine duty. But even as the crusading vocabulary took hold, the ground-level reality continued to resist it. The military religious orders that emerged in the 12th century, the orders of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcántara, were simultaneously the most ideologically committed fighters in the Reconquista and the most pragmatically flexible in their actual operations. They built castles on the frontier, administered conquered territories, and negotiated continuously with Muslim neighbors. The frontier zone remained, as it had always been, a place where the certainties of ideology met the complications of daily life. In 1196, an incident occurred that illuminates just how unstable the religious framing remained, even at this late stage. After Alfonso VIII of Castile suffered a defeat at the hands of the Almohads, a later North African dynasty that had replaced the Almoravids, two of his fellow Christian kings responded in a way that the Holy War narrative would find difficult to explain. Alfonso IX of Leon and Sancho VII of Navarre entered an alliance with the Almohads and invaded Castile. A crusade was formally declared against them, one Christian kingdom crusading against another, with Muslim allies. It took direct papal pressure to end the alliance. The Almohads, like the Almoravids before them, had introduced a harder edge to Islamic rule in Iberia. Where the Taifa courts had been culturally eclectic, philosophically sophisticated, and broadly tolerant of religious difference, the Almohads were none of these things. Under their rule, Jews in Cordoba faced a choice of conversion, exile, or worse. The young Maimonides, who would become the greatest Jewish philosopher of the medieval world, was forced to flee. The convivencia was not abolished by the Christian Reconquista alone. It was eroded from both sides simultaneously as the ideological temperature of the conflict rose and the space for complexity narrowed. By the 13th century, the military balance had shifted decisively. The Great Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 brought the armies of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal together under papal blessing and shattered the Almohad forces in Iberia. It was one of the most significant military engagements of the medieval world, and its consequences were immediate. Within a generation, Cordoba had fallen to Castile, Seville had fallen, Valencia had fallen. The Moorish presence in Iberia, which had once covered almost the entire peninsula, was now reduced to a single remaining emirate in the south. Its capital was Granada. It would survive for another 250 years. The Emirate of Granada was not a relic. It was a functioning state, sophisticated, prosperous, diplomatically active, sustained partly by its own resources and partly by the same system of pariahs and negotiated relationships that had characterized the peninsula for centuries. The Nasrid dynasty that ruled it paid tribute to Castile, supplied Castilian armies with soldiers, and maintained an elaborate network of alliances that kept the emirate alive long after its neighbors had fallen. Granada endured not because no one could take it, but because, for 250 years, the kings of Castile found it more useful as a tributary than as a conquest. This is the Reconquista as it actually existed across most of its 781 years, not a holy war marching steadily toward an inevitable Christian victory, but a fluctuating, contradictory, frequently self-defeating competition for territory and power in which the religious framing was one tool among many, used when useful, set aside when inconvenient. The people living inside it, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, were not principally characters in a religious drama. They were farmers, merchants, soldiers, scholars, and rulers trying to navigate a world that demanded constant negotiation with people who prayed differently and called the same land by different names. The Reconquista's myth, the clean, holy, inevitable Christian reconquest of a sacred homeland, was not a description of this world. It was a project to replace it. And the people who built that project, most deliberately, most systematically, and with the most consequential results, were not the fighters of the 8th century or the crusaders of the 12th. They were a king and a queen who came to power in the second half of the 15th century and understood with complete clarity what a unified religious narrative could justify. Their names were Ferdinand and Isabella. And to understand what they built and why they built it the way they did, you have to understand what came before them. Not as a holy war finally nearing its end, but as a living, complicated civilization that was about to be asked to choose, once and for all, what it wanted to be. The choosing would not be gentle, and the consequences of the choice would not stay inside the borders of Spain. They would cross an ocean, consume a hemisphere, and run forward through centuries in ways that the last Sultan of Granada riding out through the Gate of the Seven Floors on the morning of January the 2nd, 1492, could not have imagined and would not have wished to. A myth is never built in a day. It is built across generations, added to, refined, stripped of its contradictions, and eventually presented as something that was always obvious. The Holy War narrative of the Reconquista did not exist in 711 when Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait. It did not fully exist in 722 when Pelayo fought at Covadonga. It was assembled slowly, out of genuine religious feeling and deliberate political calculation by people who understood that a story about what you are fighting for is just as powerful as the fighters themselves. The raw material was always there. The Christian kingdoms of the north did understand themselves in religious terms. The kings of Asturias and Leon traced their lineage back to the Visigoths and claimed a right of inheritance over the whole peninsula. The pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela, the shrine of St. James in the northwest of Spain, gave the Christian north a spiritual geography that connected scattered kingdoms around a single sacred destination. The idea that Iberia was Christian land temporarily under occupation was present from the beginning. What changed over centuries was how systematically and purposefully that idea was developed into political theology. The turning point came from outside the peninsula. In 1099, the armies of the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, and the concept of holy war, fighting for territory against non-Christians as a meritorious spiritual act, entered the vocabulary of European Christian politics with a force it had never previously had. The crusading movement gave the papacy a new instrument of power, a new language for mobilizing armies, and a new framework for understanding conflict between Christians and Muslims anywhere in the world. Within a decade, that framework was being applied to Iberia. The papacy had taken an interest in the Iberian campaigns even before the First Crusade. From the 1060s onward, popes had occasionally offered spiritual rewards to fighters in Spain, similar to those offered to crusaders in the Holy Land. After 1099, this became more systematic. The Iberian conflict was formally designated a crusading theater. Fighting there carried the same spiritual weight as fighting in Jerusalem. Dying there earned the same divine reward. The effect was not immediate. The ground-level reality of shifting alliances and pragmatic coexistence did not vanish overnight, but the ideological temperature of the conflict began to rise. The military religious orders that emerged in the 12th century were the institutional expression of this new temperature. The Order of Santiago, founded in 1170, and the Orders of Calatrava and Alcantara, both established around the same period, were fighting organizations built on crusading principles. Their members took religious vows and understood their military service as spiritual duty. They built castles on the frontier, administered conquered territories, and became significant landowners and political forces in their own right. They were also, in practice, exactly as pragmatic as everyone else in Iberia. They negotiated, administered multi-faith populations, and operated in the same complicated world their theology was trying to simplify. What was happening simultaneously, and more quietly, was a shift in how the past was being written. The chronicles produced in the Christian courts of the North began, increasingly, to reframe the preceding centuries. The fluid allegiances, the pragmatic coexistence, the Muslim soldiers in Christian armies and Christian soldiers in Muslim ones. These did not fit the narrative that was becoming useful. The chronicles emphasized religious conflict, simplified the motivations of the fighters, and progressively constructed a story in which the Christian kingdoms had always been engaged in a single, coherent, divinely sanctioned project of reconquest. History was being written backwards, and the contradictions were being smoothed away as it was written. The rise of the Almohads in the 12th century gave the hardening narrative a genuine enemy to work with. The Almohad dynasty, which had displaced the Almoravids and now controlled much of Al-Andalus and North Africa, was genuinely hostile to the kind of religious pluralism that had characterized the earlier Andalusian courts. Under Almohad rule, The philosophical and scientific culture of Al-Andalus contracted. The Jewish communities that had thrived in Cordoba and elsewhere faced a choice between conversion and departure. The convivencia, already eroded at the edges, was now being attacked from the Muslim side as seriously as from the Christian one. For the crusading narrative, this was useful. An enemy that looked more like what the narrative required made the narrative easier to believe. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was the moment the military balance shifted permanently. The combined armies of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, fighting under a papal crusading banner, shattered the Almohad force in southern Spain. The Almohad Empire never recovered. Within a generation, Cordoba fell to Ferdinand III of Castile in 1236, Seville in 1248. The great cities of Al-Andalus, the cities that had held the libraries, the hospitals, the translation workshops, the courts where three faiths had worked alongside each other, were now Christian cities. The populations who remained were governed by new rulers with a new vocabulary for what they were doing. Ferdinand III, who would be canonized by the Catholic Church as a saint, was a genuinely pious man who also understood the practical value of his Muslim and Jewish subjects. Cordoba and Seville under his rule were not cities from which the Moorish population was expelled. They were cities in which the power had changed hands while much of the population remained. The great mosque of Cordoba was converted into a cathedral, but the city continued to function with a diverse population. The administrative expertise, the agricultural knowledge, the commercial networks that Al-Andalus had built over 5 centuries did not disappear when the flags changed. They continued, under new management, to sustain the prosperity that the Christian kingdoms were inheriting, but the inheritance came with a problem. The Christian kingdoms were absorbing enormous numbers of people who were not Christian. Muslims who had chosen to remain in their cities rather than depart for North Africa, Jews whose communities had existed in Iberia since Roman times, and a growing population of conversos, people who had converted to Christianity, voluntarily or under pressure, from both faiths. The conversos occupied a peculiar and increasingly uncomfortable position. They were legally Christian. They participated in Christian institutions, in many cases rose to positions of significant influence in the church and in government, and a substantial portion of the old Christian population did not trust them. The distrust had a specific shape. It focused not on what the conversos did, but on what they might be hiding. The secret continuation of Jewish or Muslim practice beneath a Christian exterior. The Spanish word for those who converted from Judaism was converso. The word for those suspected of secretly continuing to practice Judaism was a term whose origins are disputed, but whose contempt was unmistakable. The fear that conversion was performance, rather than genuine transformation, drove a suspicion that no amount of outward Christian behavior could entirely dispel, because the suspicion had located the problem not in practice but in blood. In 1449, the city of Toledo took a step that would prove more consequential than any battle of the Reconquista. A municipal edict was issued formally barring conversos from holding public office. The justification was explicitly racial. Conversos were excluded not because of what they believed or how they behaved, but because of their ancestry. This was the first formal legal codification of what would become the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Pope Nicholas V condemned it. Distinguished churchmen of non-Jewish origin condemned it. It spread anyway. By the end of the 15th century, purity of blood statutes had been adopted by most Spanish institutions. Guilds, religious confraternities, universities, military orders, chapters of the church. To hold office, to join an order, to marry into a respectable family, a Spaniard increasingly needed to demonstrate that no Jewish or Muslim blood ran in their ancestry. The problem was that, after centuries of conversion and intermarriage, this was an enormous percentage of the Spanish population. Families that had been Christian for generations found themselves suspect. The anxiety was not marginal, it was structural, embedded in the institutions of a society that had spent centuries absorbing the very people it was now trying to exclude. Into this world, in October 1469, two royal heirs married in a small ceremony in the city of Valladolid. Ferdinand of Aragon was 17 years old. Isabella of Castile was 18. They had met only a few days before the wedding. The marriage was a political calculation of the first order. It united the two largest Christian kingdoms of the peninsula under a single dynastic roof, and it had been conducted in secret because Isabella's half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile, opposed it. A papal dispensation had been obtained to permit the marriage, since the two were second cousins. The dispensation was signed by a pope who was already dead. The document had been forged. Ferdinand and Isabella were, from the beginning, people who understood that the ends they pursued required instruments that the existing order had not yet provided. They were not cynics, both were genuinely devout, and their faith was a real force in their decision-making. But they were also supremely effective political operators who grasped, with complete clarity, what a unified religious identity could do for a fragmented kingdom. The Spanish Inquisition, which they established in 1478 with a papal bull, extracted from Pope Sixtus IV under considerable pressure, was not primarily a theological institution. It was a political one, and it served political purposes first. The Inquisition's stated target was the converso population, specifically those suspected of practicing Judaism or Islam in secret while presenting a Christian face. Its actual function was considerably broader. By giving the crown direct control over a judicial institution with the power to investigate, try, and punish anyone of Jewish or Muslim ancestry, Ferdinand and Isabella had created an instrument of surveillance and social control that reached into every institution in the kingdom. Property confiscated from those convicted funded the crown. Fear of investigation suppressed opposition. The machinery of religious purity was also the machinery of political consolidation. Pope Sixtus IV, within 4 years of issuing the bull that authorized the Spanish Inquisition, was publicly condemning its excesses. His objections had no effect. Ferdinand had extracted the original authorization by threatening to withdraw Spanish military support at a moment when the Ottoman Turks were pressing toward Rome. The Pope had given way to the pressure. Now that the instrument was running, there was no mechanism to stop it. The Spanish Inquisition would operate for 350 years, prosecuting an estimated 150,000 people and functioning as a permanent reminder that in the new Spain, the boundaries of who belonged were drawn in blood rather than belief. The concept of limpieza de sangre, blood purity, was something genuinely new in European history, and historians have noted its significance with a care that the term requires. It was not simply religious discrimination, which had existed for centuries. It was something closer to what later centuries would recognize as racial thinking. The idea that ancestry itself, independent of behavior or belief, determined a person's fundamental nature and their fitness for membership in society. A converso, who had been Christian for 3 generations, who had Christian children and grandchildren who had served the church faithfully, remained suspect because of the blood that ran in their veins. The body itself had become the site of suspicion. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella turned their attention to the final conquest of Granada in the 1480s, the ideological infrastructure of the new Spain was substantially in place. The Inquisition was operating. Blood purity statutes governed entry into the institutions of power. The language of crusade had been folded into the language of national identity. What remained was the final military act, the elimination of the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula, and the decisions that would immediately follow it. Those decisions had already been made, in principle, before the first cannon was pointed at the walls of Granada. The conquest was the last step in a process that had been building for a century. What came after it was not a consequence of victory. It was its purpose. The Granada War, which Ferdinand and Isabella launched in 1482, was the most expensive military campaign in Spanish history to that point. It lasted 10 years, consumed enormous resources, and was conducted with a systematic professionalism that reflected how completely the nature of Iberian warfare had changed since the days of shifting alliances and pragmatic coexistence. This was not a border conflict, it was an elimination. The Emirate of Granada, which had survived for 2.5 centuries as a tributary state, was now being dismantled with the full combined power of United Castile and Aragon behind it. The Nasrid sultans who ruled Granada in its final years understood what was coming. They had watched the Almohad cities fall, one by one, across the preceding 2 centuries. They had maintained their emirate through a combination of military skill, diplomatic agility, and the consistent willingness of the Castilian kings to accept tribute rather than conquest. Ferdinand and Isabella were not interested in tribute. They were interested in completion. The Reconquista, as they had chosen to define it, required an endpoint. Granada was that endpoint, and the logic that had driven the Inquisition and the blood purity statutes required that the endpoint be absolute. On January 2nd, 1492, Muhammad XII, known in Spanish sources as Boabdil, rode out of the Alhambra and handed its keys to Isabella of Castile. The Reconquista, by its own retrospective definition, was over. But the machinery that had been built to conduct it, the Inquisition, the blood purity doctrine, the theology of purification, did not stop running when the war ended. It had been running for over a decade before the final surrender. It would run for centuries after, and in the weeks and months that followed the fall of Granada, the people who had built that machinery demonstrated, in 3 rapid decisions, exactly what it had always been for. The first decision came in March of 1492. The Alhambra decree, named for the palace whose keys Isabella had received just 2 months earlier, ordered the expulsion of every Jewish person from Spain. Those who converted to Christianity could remain. Those who did not had 4 months to leave, taking with them whatever they could carry, surrendering whatever they could not. The Jewish community of Spain was one of the largest and most ancient in the world. They had been in Iberia since at least Roman times, 1,000 years before the Reconquista began. They were gone within a summer. The second decision was already in motion before the ink on the Alhambra decree was dry. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who had been petitioning Ferdinand and Isabella for years, received his commission to sail west. The contract was signed. The voyage was funded. The logic connecting these 2 decisions, the expulsion of the Jews and the funding of Columbus, is not coincidental. Both were expressions of the same project, the construction of a unified, purified, expansionist Spain that would carry its version of Christianity outward, first to the south and east and now to the west. The Reconquista was not ending, it was changing direction. The third decision would come more slowly, across the years and decades that followed. The Muslim population that had remained in Spain after the fall of Granada, the Moriscos, as they would come to be called, were initially promised of the right to maintain their faith and their customs under the terms of the surrender. Those promises did not hold. Within a decade, forced conversion campaigns had begun in Granada. Within a generation, the choice of conversion or expulsion that had been given to the Jews was being extended to the Muslims. Spain was enacting, systematically and with institutional thoroughness, the elimination of the very civilization whose intellectual inheritance had made it capable of building the empire it was now assembling. The Holy War had not ended at Granada. It had simply found new targets. The Granada War had been running for 10 years when it ended. Ferdinand and Isabella had launched it in 1482 with a systematic professionalism that the Reconquista had rarely seen before, not the raiding and trading and shifting of borders that had characterized most of the preceding 7 centuries, but a sustained, resourced, coordinated campaign of conquest with a fixed objective and the combined power of united Castile and Aragon behind it. The Nasrid Emirate of Granada had survived for 2.5 centuries by being useful. It was no longer being allowed to be useful. The end had been a matter of when, not whether, since the campaign began. Muhammad XII had not wanted the throne. He had been drawn into it by the dynastic chaos of his father's court, forced it into conflict with his own father and uncle in a succession struggle that weakened Granada at precisely the moment its greatest external threat was assembling. He was around 20 years old when he first claimed the Sultanate in 1482, barely left the Alhambra, with no experience of the world beyond his troubled family's walls. He would spend the next decade watching his kingdom dismantled, city by city, fortress by fortress, in a war he had neither chosen nor could win. The siege of Granada itself lasted months. Ferdinand and Isabella had constructed a new town outside the city walls. They called it Santa Fe, Holy Faith, as a permanent military base and a statement of intent. They were not leaving. The city could hold out or it could negotiate, but it could not survive indefinitely against the combined resources of the largest unified Christian kingdom in European history. In November of 1491, Muhammad XII signed the Capitulation Treaty. The formal surrender was set for the 2nd day of January, 1492. The morning of January the 2nd was cold. Muhammad XII rode out of the Alhambra at the head of a small retinue. Accounts say roughly 80 to 100 horsemen, well-dressed, the dignity of the occasion maintained even in defeat. Ferdinand and Isabella had approached Granada accompanied by the Cardinal of Spain and a retinue of courtiers and noblemen. Among the assembled witnesses was a Genoese sailor who had been petitioning the court for years. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he later recorded the moment in his own diary. The keys passed hands without Muhammad XII having to kneel or kiss the hands of the Catholic monarchs. His mother Aisha had insisted on this last preservation of dignity in the terms of the surrender. He rode south toward exile. At a high point on the road, at a place that would come to be called the Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's sigh, he is said to have reined in his horse and turned to look back at the Alhambra one final time. His mother, riding beside him, is recorded as saying words that have survived in various forms, that he wept like a woman over what he could not defend like a man. Whether she said them or not, the image endured. It was the kind of image that a moment of genuine historical weight produces, a man looking back at the end of a world. The Alhambra that Muhammad XII was leaving behind was not simply a palace. It was the accumulated physical expression of 8 centuries of Islamic civilization in the Iberian Peninsula, its courtyards designed around the sound of water, its walls covered in geometric patterns of extraordinary mathematical precision, its inscriptions in Arabic repeating a single phrase that appears hundreds of times throughout the complex. There is no victor but God. Ferdinand and Isabella did not sleep there that night. The palace would eventually become a royal residence, then a military barracks, then a ruin, before its significance was finally recognized and it was restored. What it was on January the 2nd, 1492, was the most beautiful building in Europe, and it had just changed hands. Muhammad XII went first to a small territory in the Alpujarras Mountains that had been granted to him under the terms of the surrender. He did not stay long. Within a few years he had crossed to North Africa, settling eventually in Fez in Morocco, where he died in exile, having never returned to Granada. The Alhambra stood. The man who had handed over its keys would spend the rest of his life in a country that was not his, looking, perhaps, back across the water at something he could no longer reach. The terms of the surrender had promised the Muslim population of Granada the right to maintain their faith, their customs, their language, and their property. Ferdinand and Isabella had signed these guarantees. The document existed. It would not hold for a decade. But in January of 1492, the promises were still in place, and the political attention of the Catholic monarchs had already moved forward to the next decision, which had been waiting for years and could now no longer be deferred. The man who had been pushing hardest for that decision was Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor. Torquemada had been arguing for years that the continued presence of practicing Jews in Spain made the Inquisition's task impossible. The logic was circular but effective. The converso population was suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practice. The Jewish community provided a living reference point for that practice. Therefore, as long as Jews remained in Spain, the sincerity of every Jewish convert was in doubt. Remove the Jews, and the converts would have nothing to revert to. Ferdinand and Isabella had resisted this argument for years. They had Jewish conversos in senior positions in their own administration. But Granada had now fallen, and the great project of unification was complete. The Jews, as one account put it bluntly, were now expendable. On the 31st of March, 1492, less than 3 months after the keys of the Alhambra had been handed over, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. It ordered the expulsion of every practicing Jew from Spain. Those who converted to Christianity could remain. Those who did not had until the 31st of July, 4 months, to settle their affairs and leave. They could not take gold, silver, or minted coin. They could not take horses or weapons. They could take whatever else they could carry, sell what they could not carry, and depart. The Jewish community of Spain was one of the oldest in the world. Jews had been in the Iberian Peninsula since at least the Roman period, a presence of over 1,000 years, predating the arrival of the Visigoths, predating the Muslim conquest, predating the Christian kingdoms that were now expelling them. They had been physicians, translators, administrators, philosophers, financiers, and scholars. Maimonides had been one of them. The translation workshops that had fed ancient knowledge into European universities had depended on them. The intellectual life of Al-Andalus at its height had been built in part by them. They had survived the Almohad persecution by fleeing north into the Christian kingdoms. They had survived the pogroms of 1391 by converting in their hundreds of thousands. Now the remainder, those who had held to their faith through all of it, were being told to leave. The numbers are disputed and significant. By 1492, the century of persecution and forced conversion had already dramatically reduced the practicing Jewish population of Spain. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 Jews were expelled under the decree. Those who chose exile over conversion. Over 200,000 had already converted to Catholicism in the preceding century to remain in their homes. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, when he heard what Spain had done, is said to have remarked that he could not call Ferdinand a wise king, a king who had impoverished his own country and enriched others. The Ottoman Empire welcomed the expelled Spanish Jews, the Sephardim, with open arms. Their skills, their networks, their knowledge arrived in Constantinople and Thessaloniki and across the eastern Mediterranean, and they were put to use. Columbus recorded the moment in the opening lines of his diary. He wrote that, in the same month in which their majesties issued the edict that all Jews should be driven out of the kingdom and its territories, in the same month they gave him the order to undertake his expedition of discovery to the Indies. He placed the two events in the same sentence, in the same breath. Not because he thought they were the same kind of event, but because they happened simultaneously, and the simultaneity was simply the fact of his experience. He could not use the port of Cadiz when he departed in August because the harbor was crowded with Jewish families' boarding ships for whatever destinations they could reach. The commission Columbus had finally received had been a long time coming. He had been petitioning courts for years. Portugal had rejected him. Spain had rejected him twice through its own royal commissions. Isabella had told him, on one occasion, that he could petition again after the Reconquista was complete. When Granada fell in January, he had been summoned back to court. The contract was signed in April. The expedition was funded not by Isabella selling her jewels, as legend has it, but largely by two court officials, both Jewish conversos, named Luis de Santangel and Gabriel Sanchez. The voyage that would open the Western Hemisphere was financed by men whose community had just been expelled from Spain. Columbus sailed on the 3rd of August, 1492. He carried with him letters of introduction addressed to the rulers of Asia, letters in Latin with blank spaces for names, because no one knew exactly who he would encounter. He carried with him an Arabic-speaking interpreter because Arabic was the closest thing available to a universal language of diplomacy and trade. He carried with him the accumulated navigational knowledge of a maritime tradition that had been built in part by the same Andalusian scholars, whose civilization had just been dismantled, and he sailed west into an ocean that European cartography had barely begun to map, funded by men who no longer had a country. 3 months later, on the 12th of October, he made landfall in the Bahamas. He called the people he found there Indians because he believed he had reached Asia. He claimed the land for Castile. He noted in his diary that the people he encountered were gentle, curious, and unarmed. He also noted that they appeared willing and compliant, and that a small number of men could bring them entirely under Spanish authority. The Reconquista had crossed the ocean. The logic that had driven it, the logic of territorial claim, of religious mandate, of the right to take from those who were not the right kind of Christian, had found a new hemisphere to operate in. Back in Spain, the machinery that had produced these 3 decisions in a single year continued to run. The Inquisition, which had been operating since 1478, was now turning its attention with renewed intensity to the converso population, those who had converted to escape the expulsion decree, and the much larger mass of those who had converted in the preceding century. The question the Inquisition was designed to answer, are you really Christian, or are you performing Christianity while secretly remaining Jewish, was a question that could never be definitively answered, which meant the investigation could never be definitively concluded. The machinery of suspicion had been built without an off switch. The Muslim population of Granada, living under the guarantees that Ferdinand and Isabella had signed in the surrender terms, watched what was happening to the Jewish community and understood what it meant for them. The promises had held for a few years. They had been issued sincerely enough. The Catholic monarchs had practical reasons to maintain stability in a newly conquered city, but by 1499, the Cardinal of Spain, Francisco Cisneros, had arrived in Granada to accelerate what he considered an unacceptably slow pace of conversion. His methods were not gentle. Within months, a rebellion had broken out in the Albayacan quarter of Granada, the first of several uprisings in the following years that the crown used as justification for voiding the surrender terms entirely. In 1502, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the decree that the Muslims of Castile must convert or leave. The choice that had been given to the Jews 10 years earlier was now extended to the Muslims. Most converted, or appeared to convert. The Moriscos, as the converted Muslims came to be known, occupied the same position the conversos had occupied. Legally Christian, socially suspect, their sincerity perpetually in question, their ancestry a permanent liability under the doctrine of limpieza de sangre. The Inquisition, having processed the Jewish converso population, turned its attention to them. The year 1492, seen whole, is one of the most concentrated expressions of a single political logic in recorded history. The fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, the commission of Columbus. These were not coincidences of the calendar. They were the operating logic of a unified Spain made visible in a sequence. The Reconquista, as Ferdinand and Isabella had defined it, required a Spain that was religiously uniform, territorially complete, and outwardly expanding. Granada provided the completion. The expulsion of the Jews provided the uniformity, or the appearance of it, since the conversos remained and the Inquisition remained to watch them. Columbus provided the expansion. What 1492 did not provide was an ending. The problems that had driven the Reconquista, the anxiety about who truly belonged, the machinery of suspicion directed at those whose ancestry was the wrong kind, the logic that said expansion was the solution to internal disorder, did not resolve when the last sultan rode south and the last ship of Jewish exiles cleared the harbor. They had been built into the institutions of Spain too deeply to dissolve with a change of year. The Inquisition would run for another 3 centuries. The Moriscos would be expelled entirely in 1609. The empire that Columbus had opened would carry the same logic across the ocean and apply it to a hemisphere that had never heard of the Reconquista and would pay an enormous price for that ignorance. In 1492, the most beautiful palace in Europe had changed hands. The oldest community in Spain had been expelled, and a sailor who believed he was heading for Asia had instead found a world that no European map had ever shown. Any one of these events would have been among the most significant of the century. All three happened in the same year, driven by the same people for the same reasons. The year 1492 was not the end of the Reconquista. It was the moment the Reconquista became something larger than itself, something that would take centuries more to fully work out its consequences, and that the world is, in various ways, still working out now. Muhammad XII died in Fez, in exile, sometime around 1533. The exact date is not recorded. He had lived long enough to see Spain begin to build the empire whose foundations had been laid on the morning he handed over the keys of the Alhambra. He had lived long enough to hear what had happened to the Jews who had been expelled in the same year he rode south. He had lived long enough to see the promises made to his people in the surrender terms broken, one by one, until there were no promises left. What he thought about all of it in the years of exile in a city that was not his, the record does not say. The Suspiro del Moro, the place where he had paused to look back, still exists today on the road south of Granada. The view of the Alhambra from that point is unchanged. The Alhambra itself survived. It survived because, in the end, even the people who had conquered it could not bring themselves to destroy it. It was too beautiful, too extraordinary, too clearly the work of a civilization that had achieved something no European kingdom of the same period had matched. Ferdinand and Isabella moved in. Later monarchs added their own buildings alongside the Nasrid palaces, the contrast in quality unignorable even to sympathetic eyes. The Alhambra became a symbol of what Spain had won. It is also, unavoidably, a monument to what to Spain had ended, and to the question that the Reconquista raises but does not answer. What does it mean to inherit the achievements of a civilization you have destroyed? That question followed Spain into the new world it was building. It followed the Inquisition through its 3 centuries of operation. It followed the Moriscos into their exile in 1609, when the last of the converted Muslims were finally expelled, and the agricultural systems they had maintained for generations began to fail. It followed the empire through its expansion and through its eventual collapse. It is the question that the Reconquista leaves open, not as a rebuke, not as a verdict, but as a consequence. The same logic that built one of the most powerful empires in history also destroyed the civilization that had made that empire possible. Both things are true. Both things matter, and neither one can be understood without the other. The empire that Columbus opened did not grow slowly. Within a single generation of his first landfall in 1492, Spanish forces had crossed the Caribbean, reached the American mainland, and encountered 2 of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. The Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, both of them larger in population than most European kingdoms, both of them possessed of cities, administrative systems, agricultural technologies, and intellectual traditions of extraordinary complexity, were dismantled within decades by forces that were vastly outnumbered, but carried with them 2 advantages that no military preparation could have countered: epidemic disease and the institutional machinery of the Reconquista. The machinery arrived intact. The encomienda system, the legal framework through which Spanish settlers were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous populations, was based explicitly on the tribute systems developed during the Reconquista. The military orders that had fought on the Iberian frontier carried their structures into the New World. The theology of holy war that had justified the conversion or expulsion of Muslims and Jews in Spain was applied, with minimal modification, to the peoples of the Americas. The Reconquista had been fought over 781 years in one peninsula. In the Americas, its logic was applied to 2 continents simultaneously, with a speed that the original conflict had never approached. Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican mainland in 1519 with roughly 500 men. Within 2 years, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in Spain, built on a lake with aqueducts and causeways and a market that the Spanish soldiers who saw it described with undisguised astonishment, had fallen. Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru in 1532 with fewer than 200 men and captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa in a single afternoon. The conquests were not simply military achievements. They were made possible by the smallpox and measles and influenza that the Spanish carried with them and that the indigenous populations had no immunity to face. The demographic consequences were among the worst in recorded human history. Historians estimate that the indigenous population of Mexico fell from approximately 25 million at the time of the Spanish arrival to around 1 million within the first century of contact, a reduction of roughly 96%. The causes were multiple. Disease was the primary driver, but the labor demands of the encomienda system, the disruption of food production, and direct violence compounded the effect. The Americas that Columbus had described as full of gentle, curious people were emptied by a process that the Reconquista's institutional logic had made both possible and, in the minds of those conducting it, justified. The justification used the same vocabulary that had been used in Iberia. The peoples of the Americas were being offered the opportunity to accept Christianity. Those who accepted it were, in principle, to be protected as subjects of the crown. Those who resisted were legitimate targets of conquest. The theological debate about whether this framework was valid, and there were serious theologians in Spain, most notably Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued strenuously that it was not, did not change the practice on the ground. Las Casas spent decades documenting the destruction he witnessed and petitioning the crown to reform the system. His petitions produced the new laws of 1542, which attempted to limit the encomienda. They were largely ignored by the settlers who benefited from it. The silver that flowed out of the Americas did what silver on that scale always does. It created an illusion of wealth while undermining the conditions that produce it. The mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and the silver deposits of Mexico produced quantities of precious metal that had no precedent in European history. By the end of the 16th century, American silver constituted roughly a quarter of the Spanish crown's total revenue. The Spanish Empire was the wealthiest state in Europe, and it was functionally bankrupt. Philip II declared state bankruptcy 4 times during his reign, in 1557, 1575, 1596, and again in 1596. He was simultaneously the richest and most indebted monarch in Christendom. The mechanism was well understood by contemporary observers, who noted that everything in Spain was expensive except silver. The massive influx of American bullion had caused prices to rise across the European economy, the phenomenon historians call the price revolution. Spanish manufactures became uncompetitive. The productive industries that had once sustained the Iberian economy, the silk works, the wool trade, the agricultural output that the Moorish irrigation systems had made possible, were hollowed out by inflation and by the flight of skilled labor and capital. The empire was consuming the foundations it stood on. The Inquisition, running continuously since 1478, was contributing to this hollowing in ways that were harder to quantify but no less real. The doctrine of limpieza de sangre, blood purity, had, by the 16th century, created a social hierarchy in which old Christian ancestry was the primary qualification for institutional advancement. In a country where centuries of conversion and intermarriage had blurred the line between old and new Christian almost beyond recovery, the result was a permanent atmosphere of suspicion that reached into every family, every institution, every profession. The people most likely to possess the commercial, medical, and scholarly skills that a functioning empire required were also the people most likely to be of converso ancestry and therefore most exposed to investigation. The loss was not abstract. The Jewish communities expelled in 1492 had taken with them networks of trade, medical knowledge, financial expertise, and scholarly capability that had been built over centuries of participation in the most sophisticated intellectual culture in medieval Europe. The Ottoman Empire, which had received the expelled Sephardim with open arms, put that expertise to immediate use. Sultan Bayezid II, who reportedly said that Ferdinand had impoverished his own country by driving out the Jews, was not simply making a rhetorical point. He was describing an economic reality that Spanish contemporaries were already beginning to recognize, and that the following century would make unmistakable. The Moriscos, the converted Muslims who had remained in Spain after the forced conversions of 1502, were the next to go. The process was slower than the Jewish expulsion and considerably more contested. The Moriscos were a substantial portion of the Spanish population, concentrated in the agricultural regions of Valencia, Aragon, and Granada, where they maintained the irrigation systems and farming technique that the Moorish civilization had developed over 8 centuries. The Valencian aristocracy, whose wealth depended on Morisco labor, fought against expulsion for decades. The economic argument was clear and specific. Without the Moriscos, the irrigated fields of Valencia would fail. The argument did not prevail. In 1609, Philip III signed the expulsion decree for the Moriscos of Valencia. Over the following 5 years, the expulsion was extended across the whole of Spain. Estimates of the total number expelled range from 275,000 to 300,000. In a country whose total population was roughly 7.5 million, this represented approximately 4% of the entire workforce, concentrated in the most agriculturally productive regions. In Valencia, which lost a third of its total population in the expulsion, nearly half the villages were recorded as deserted by 1638. Theosakia systems. The networks of irrigation canals and water-sharing arrangements that the Moorish settlers had built and the Morisco communities had maintained for generations began to fail within years of the expulsion. The technical knowledge required to maintain them had walked out with the people who held it. The agricultural productivity of the regions that had been most fertile under Moorish cultivation declined in ways that Spanish agriculture would spend centuries attempting to recover. The Reconquista had begun as a contest for land. In its final act, it had destroyed the knowledge that made the land worth having. The Inquisition turned next to whatever remained. With the Jewish converso population processed across the preceding century and the Morisco community expelled, the tribunals of the Holy Office found new targets: Protestant heretics, alleged witches, people who owned the wrong books, members of religious minorities who had taken refuge in the Spanish Empire. In the colonies, the Inquisition's reach extended to converso communities that had emigrated to the Americas, hoping to rebuild lives beyond the surveillance of the peninsular tribunals. The last person put to death by the Inquisition in the New World met that fate in the 19th century. The institution that Ferdinand and Isabella had built in 1478 as a tool of political consolidation outlasted the empire it had been built to serve. The Spanish Armada of 1588 is the moment the world tends to identify as the beginning of the end. The great fleet that Philip II assembled to invade England, 130 ships, the largest naval force Europe had ever assembled, was scattered by English ships in North Sea storms, and it never reached the beaches it was aimed at. The defeat was a shock to a court that had understood Spain's naval supremacy as something close to divine endorsement. It was not the end of Spanish power, which would persist in various forms for another century, but it marked the point at which the narrative of inevitable Spanish triumph that the Reconquista had constructed began to visibly fail. The 17th century was the century in which Spain's structural contradictions became impossible to manage. The silver imports from the Americas declined as the mines were exhausted and the indigenous labor force that had worked them shrank toward extinction. The bankruptcies continued. Philip III inherited a kingdom already in financial crisis and made it worse through a combination of fiscal improvidence and the economic shock of the Morisco expulsion. The plague of 1599 killed roughly 500,000 people in Castile alone, a tenth of the total population. The 30 Years' War consumed Spanish military resources across 3 decades of continental conflict that the empire could not afford and could not disengage from. The Dutch Republic, which had begun its revolt against Spanish rule in 1568, achieved formal recognition of its independence at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the same peace that ended the 30 Years' War. The loss of the Netherlands was not simply territorial. The Dutch had built on the commercial and financial networks that the expelled Jewish and Morisco communities had partly helped to seed, the most dynamic trading economy in the world. Amsterdam had replaced Seville as the commercial capital of the Atlantic. The skills and networks that Spain had driven out of its own territory had found a home in the country that was now outcompeting it. The internal contradictions of an empire built on exclusion were showing up in the places where they were hardest to ignore. The blood purity doctrine, which had been designed to create a unified and trustworthy ruling class, had instead produced a nobility that was more concerned with the management of ancestry claims than with the development of productive capacity. Entry into the institutions of power required proof of old Christian lineage. Earning that proof required genealogical investigation, legal documentation, and the suppression of any information that might complicate the claim. The energy devoted to the management of ancestral purity was energy not devoted to commerce, manufacturing, or the kind of productive activity that builds lasting wealth. The colonies, meanwhile, were developing their own hierarchies of blood that mirrored and extended the peninsular model. The limpieza de sangre doctrine, exported across the Atlantic, generated the elaborate caste systems of colonial Spanish America, the categories of peninsular Spaniard, Creole, mestizo, mulatto, and dozens of finer gradations, each carrying different legal rights and social status, each requiring its own documentation and maintenance. The Reconquista's answer to the problem of diversity, classification, hierarchy, and exclusion had become the organizing principle of an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who had spent his life arguing against the destruction of the Americas, died in 1566, having seen his arguments absorbed, debated, and largely set aside by an empire that found them inconvenient. His writings survived him and became, eventually, some of the most important documents in the history of colonial criticism. But the system he had spent his life opposing continued for 3 more centuries after his death, operating on the same logic that had driven it since Ferdinand and Isabella had looked at the diversity of their kingdom and decided that diversity was a problem to be solved. The Spanish Empire reached its greatest territorial extent in the 16th century and spent the next 2 centuries contracting. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713 stripped it of its Italian territories and its hold on the Low Countries. The independence movements that swept through Spanish America in the early 19th century, from Simon Bolivar in the north to José de San Martín in the south, dismantled the continental empire in the space of 2 decades. Cuba and the Philippines were lost to the United States in 1898, a year that Spain calls simply El Desastre, the disaster. And the empire that had been built on the logic of the Reconquista was reduced to the peninsula where that logic had been born. The costs were distributed unevenly, as the costs of empires always are. The indigenous populations of the Americas bore the greatest share. The demographic catastrophe of the 16th century, the labor extraction of the encomienda, the cultural destruction of the missionary campaigns, the dismantling of the intellectual and agricultural traditions that had taken millennia to develop. The expelled Jews and Moriscos bore the cost of displacement, the loss of homes and communities, and accumulated knowledge that took generations to partially reconstruct in exile. The converso communities who remained in Spain bore the cost of permanent suspicion, the grinding anxiety of a society in which ancestry was destiny, and the wrong grandparent could undo a lifetime of orthodox behavior. Spain itself bore costs that its own chroniclers were slow to acknowledge. The intellectual traditions that had made Cordoba the ornament of the world, the translation networks, the medical schools, The philosophical conversations that crossed religious lines were gone. The agricultural systems that had made southern Spain the most productive farmland in the peninsula were degraded. The commercial networks that the Jewish and Morisco communities had maintained were operating now in Amsterdam and Constantinople and Thessaloniki, enriching cities that were not Spanish. The empire had been built on the destruction of the civilization that had made it possible, and the destruction had consequences that outlasted the empire by centuries. The Alhambra still stands in Granada, above a city that carries the marks of everything described in this account. The Moorish quarters of the Albaycin, the cathedral built inside the great mosque of Cordoba, the acequia channels still visible in the southern landscape, the Sephardic synagogues of Toledo, these are not museum pieces. They are the physical evidence of a civilization that existed, that was extraordinary, that was ended by a specific set of decisions made by specific people for specific reasons, and that left behind traces too deeply embedded in the landscape to ever be entirely removed. The Reconquista produced the Spanish Empire. That is not a small thing. The empire it produced was one of the most extensive in human history, and it shaped the political, cultural, and linguistic landscape of an entire hemisphere in ways that are still operative today. The Spanish language, spoken by 500 million people across 20 countries, is the Reconquista's most durable legacy. The Catholic faith, which the Reconquista placed at the center of Spanish identity, and which the empire carried across the ocean, shaped the religious landscape of Latin America for 5 centuries. The administrative and legal traditions that the Spanish Empire established in the Americas, for all their brutality, created the institutional frameworks within which modern states eventually emerged. These are real things. They happened, they matter. And alongside them, inseparable from them, is the full weight of what was destroyed to make them possible. The libraries of Cordoba, the irrigation systems of Valencia, the medical knowledge of the Andalusian physicians, the philosophical conversations of Toledo, the Mesoamerican codices that recorded civilizations whose sophistication we are still working to fully understand, the Jewish communities of Iberia dispersed across 3 continents, the Morisco farmers, expelled from land their ancestors had cultivated for 8 centuries, the indigenous populations of the Americas, reduced from tens of millions to a fraction of their number within a century of contact. The Reconquista did not end in 1492. It ended when the last of its consequences worked themselves out. And some of them have not yet finished working.